pretty major topic, or very important topic, empire. Definitely want to be able to compare the Mongols to other empires like the Byzantines, the Romans, the Chinese dynasties. So a very important piece of history. So a little bit about the Mongol Empire. It is considered the largest land-based empire in world history. As you can see, it stretches from the Pacific Ocean to basically Eastern Europe. And what they're known for is bringing all these kind of regions together, right, through conquest and through trade, right? So that's kind of what you want to understand in terms of significance. All right, so here's one of those other travelers or writers that we want to write down, William of Rubric. We know a lot of what we know from this French friar, again, William of Rubric. And he traveled to Mongolia in 1255. He was a crusader, and his goal was to convert the Mongols to Christianity. His writings detail a lot of the culture and help give us an understanding of what life is like. So if you see him, again, his focus was to convert Mongols to Christianity. It wasn't super successful, but you might see him as a primary source here and there. All right, so Mongolia is a small country between what is today Russia and China. So the Mongol Empire obviously expanded outside of this. So here's where Mongolia is today. It is a country today. All right, so a little bit about the geography of Mongolia. Because of the geography helped impact their economy and culture. So Central Asia is mostly grassland, very few rivers, very few trees, mountains, hills. So in order to survive in this part of the world, you really have to be nomadic. You have to hunt, you have to gather, and also you have to engage in pastoralism, right? So the Mongols were known for raising livestock. They were very mobile people. They actually traveled from location to location. They would live in yurts or small huts, and then they would pack those huts up and they would continue to travel. All right, culturally, from a religious standpoint, early Mongolian culture was spiritual. I wouldn't say polytheistic, but they did have spirit gods, multiple spirit gods, and they would actually use felt figurines as icons. They had a sky god, an earth god. So, you could say polytheistic, but I would go more about spirit worship. A shaman would be kind of their priest, and a shaman was the mediator between the gods or the spirits and the Mongols. Like early Chinese Shang dynasty, the Shang dynasty, they also would use oracle bone interpretation to interpret the future. Okay, as time would go on, some Mongol empires would become Mongol people were actually able to participate in any religion. So Mongol religion was very diversified. Buddhism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam. Okay, so we'll get more into that down the road. But for the most part, you're going to have a spirit-worshipping religion. All right, the social structure is very simple. You had two groups of Mongols. You had the families of chiefs, and then you had ordinary Mongols. And that was about it. So for the most part, society was very egalitarian, with the exception of, obviously, if your ancestry, if your family structure was tied to those chiefs. Chieftains were allowed to collect taxes. They could do it whenever they wanted to. These communities were again mobile or nomadic. They lived in these yurts or tents. They were hunter-gatherer societies or pastoralists. And early on, actually, you didn't have a Mongol empire. You had small Mongol communities, or communal organizations or communal societies. And neighbors were, for the most part, these were large communities, but they were very peaceful with one another for at least early on, before 1200. They would depend on one another for other items like grain, silk, and cotton. So early society was kind of more, I wouldn't say paleo, but similar to paleo societies, right? Small communities with a chief, right? And they were nomadic and pastoralist. All right, gender roles. Mongol women actually were very unique in that they could initiate divorce. They were political advisors and they were active in the military. You might see a painting of a Mongol woman in battle on a horse. So Mongol women had increased rights. In the Socratic Seminar, you probably read a little bit about that. Women were kind of valued, even though they had specific roles. Take care of the home, take care of the children. They did have roles that were similar to a man's role at times. All right, so Genghis Khan. His name is actually Temujin. His Mongol name was Genghis Khan. So in 1206, a Mongol tribal assembly recognized Genghis Khan as ruler. And Genghis means universal or supreme. So it's not a democracy. Again, it's more of a council. And this council, this tanistry, would choose a leader. I guess it is kind of representative government, but not so much so. But the leader are those who basically, in order to become the leader, you had to defeat your rival in battle. So it wasn't that democratic. The Kuratál was the assembly that then would recognize the new leader. Again, they didn't vote or elect him; they would just recognize and kind of do the promotion part. Genghis Khan unifies and basically creates this monster empire. And how did he rise to power? He took advantages of small tribal alliances, right? The tribal communities, he was able to kind of pit one against the other. He was a very successful military leader. His alliances or his enemies within the Mongol Empire were indecisive. And he had a great reputation of being ruthless to enemies and generous to basically those who supported him. So he was obviously someone that could acquire the loyalty of people. And when he would attack a tribe, a Mongol tribe, he would incorporate those warriors into his own forces. So instead of punishing them, he would kind of show them the light. And again, there was a lot of loyalty. So he kind of came to power through not really I guess kind of Machiavellian methods, right? Where he did use intimidation and fear, but at the same time, he did show some, gratitude and I wouldn't say compassion, but mercy. And he did, empower those who he defeated. All right, so the conquest outside of Mongolia begins in 1209. And when the conquest was done, the Mongol Empire included China, Korea, Central Asia, which would be kind of Afghanistan today, and parts of Pakistan, and Russia, and much of the Islamic Middle East and Eastern Europe, Poland, for example, and parts of Russia. The Mongol military is infamous for their success and their prowess. One thing that he did, similar to the Romans, he had military units. The Roman units, I forgot what they were called, but he basically organized the units into groups, right? 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Again, I can't think of what the Roman name was, but a very similar process. And this allowed for effective control and command. It was a united army, but each regiment might have had a specific purpose or duty, and it was headed by a leader who would then report to Genghis Khan. Soldiers displayed incredible discipline and loyalty, mostly because they were afraid to go against the leadership. They would be put to death in front of their unit if they questioned leadership. The unit leaders fought alongside their men, so there was that respect factor. And basically, if you were a soldier, you got to enjoy the wealth that you plundered. So there was a monetary interest in fighting alongside a Genghis Khan. Their tactics were brutal. Very often, a conquering or a community or a group that were about to be conquered would just give up. Not even fight because they knew it was fruitless. Those who resisted were basically slaughtered. Baghdad was massacred by one of the post Genghis Khan empires. They also used that psychological warfare where, again, groups would just surrender voluntarily because they were so afraid they knew the reputation ahead of time. Politically, something that's very similar to the Chinese dynasties, centralized government. A lot of government offices. Not like they had a capital. They had a capital, but it wouldn't look like Washington, D.C. per se physically. But they did have a central location. There were governors or daruga hachis who oversaw the conquered provinces. We saw that in Persia. We saw that in Rome, right? We see that in China as well. And these governors would collect taxes. The highest positions in government were reserved for the Mongols. And conquered people could participate, but they were in the lower branches of government. They could practice their own religion, and that's important. Genghis Khan promoted tolerance. And unlike Islamic empires, the Mongols did not require a tax. Just loyalty, just basically loyalty to the government. There were unified international laws, very important, and those laws obviously bring this empire together. Scribes were government officials who would translate laws into the various languages. So throughout this empire, you didn't have a single language. There were many different languages. And again, instead of forcing these people to have a singular language, they would just translate laws and all other things into those local languages. And going forward, even when the Mongols were gone, Asian states that came about continued these centralized processes. All right, so after Genghis Khan's death, he was replaced by Ogedei in 1229, one of his 4 sons. And he governed actually all 4 sections of the Mongol Empire. He was best known for his advance into Eastern Europe. His military took over Poland, Russia, South China, and Korea. But it's interesting is after his death, the Mongols did not pursue Western Europe. So they stopped in Poland and also Russia. God knows what the world would look like today if they continued that advancement to England or France or Germany or the Holy Roman Empire. He was known for establishing an even more efficient bureaucracy, and he actually established a capital, Karakorum. And he actually does have it was more of a modern type of capital with buildings, not yurts. All right, economically, the Mongols didn't make anything. They didn't innovate. They weren't known for that. They were known for the spread of technology. But they did have a labor force in their communities. Conquered people were always incorporated into the military, as I mentioned. Other conquered people were not turned into slaves, but were turned into laborers. They were allowed to maintain their religion. They were paid for their work. Their lives were prosperous. So really it was a win-win situation for the conquered people. The only thing they had to give up would be their nationality, perhaps. They built roads, bridges. They helped maintain the Silk Roads. They carried supplies. Astronomers were used to help predict eclipses for battle. You don't want to go fight during an eclipse. And many became map makers to help, obviously, the nomadic people travel. Merchants were used to trade Mongol plunder for desired goods. And artisans and craftsmen were usually spared from massacre and really put to work or almost enslaved to produce those craft goods. Okay. All right. The Mongols are really important to the trade of the time. They are going to protect and maintain the Silk Roads. And that's important. We have to give them a lot of credit for that. They helped kind of connect Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, right? They're going to help trade grow in Russia. They're going to help grow trade in the Middle East. They're going to help grow trade in China. They're going to continue to promote those things, right? They're not going to shut the roads down. They're going to, advance that trade. the Mongol military would protect the road from bandits, for example. So actually, trading from China to Europe was pretty easy. Writers like Marco Polo were amazed at how easy it was to trade. It wasn't difficult like you would think today, right? Traveling by foot or by horse from China to Poland, for example. There was an effect. Urban cities like Baghdad became less important because you didn't necessarily have to stop and trade. You could continue on to Constantinople. So they were less important middle points on the Silk Road, or middle destinations. The Mongols developed relay stations, kind of an early postal service. One station you could send messages and orders from one station to another. So that's important. That's a unique feature of the Mongol Empire, and it's really throughout this period we had something called the Pax Mongolia. A lot of prosperity for not only the Mongol people, but for the Middle East and for Asia because of the opening of these roads and the maintenance of these roads. And there you go. And Baghdad's here. So as you could see, the Silk Roads kind of bypassed Baghdad. Not that Baghdad wasn't an important city, but it wasn't along the road. If your city was not along the road, you were less likely to go there. You didn't need to go and trade in Baghdad. You could just continue on to where you needed to get to, which was Constantinople, or Hangzhou, or Samarkand. All right, what are the innovations that were transferred? Any kind of idea, product is going to be moved along these roads. And that's what the Mongols are going to do. As they conquer more territory, they're going to bring the things they've been using, like gunpowder from China, Muslim flamethrowers. Ideas about government from China are going to spread. The Mongols are going to adapt those ideas, and they're going to implement those ideas in Russian. The Russians will start to develop a centralized government, for example. Europeans are going to borrow the gunpowder idea from the Mongols. So that's important. Culturally, religion will continue to spread along these roads. The Mongols will promote toleration. So religions like Islam are not going to die out. They're going to continue to grow because they're accepted. All right, in 1259, the grandsons kind of come to power. And instead of a single empire, you're going to have 4 khanates. And a khanate is basically, a Mongol empire. There are 4 of them. The unified Mongol Empire was defeated by the Mamluks. Remember we mentioned the Mamluks? They're the only group to actually defeat the Mongols. The Mongol Empire wasn't destroyed, but it was broken up into smaller groups. And there was the Khanate in Iran, right here, or Persia. The Golden Horde Khanate, which would be like Russia. The Hulegu, which would be the Abbasid Empire, kind of more, you can't see it, more through here, Arabia. And then obviously the Great Khanate, which would be also the Yuan dynasty, and we'll get to that one. So the Hulegu was a grandson, and in 1258 he conquered the Abbasid territory. Sorry, Hulegu was not a Khanate. He was the early ruler of that Khanate, and he took over Abbasid territory. And it's through his expansion that Baghdad was destroyed. He killed the Caliph, and 200,000 residents were massacred. Eventually, his expansion was throughout the entire Arabia Peninsula was stopped by the Mamluks. So, the Mongols didn't get as far as Arabia or Egypt because of the Mamluks. Very powerful, again, Islamic military or empire. Also, Christian crusaders combined with the Mamluk forces to stop the Mongols. Interesting that they would form an alliance, actually, to stop the advance. Palestine, for example, this region was not under Mongol control. All right, his Khanate was the Ilkhanate, and once the Mongols were in power, they did employ Persians to serve as ministers. It's interesting that the Mongols, or the Mongol people in this Khanate, actually converted to Islam. They were attracted to it, and they made it the religion of this Khanate, where the Chinese Khanate did not convert to Islam. So you see a lot of diversity in these Mongol empires. They were tolerant of Jews and Christians, but they did support massacres of Jews and Christians by local Islamic people. So toleration, but maybe they didn't really intervene in some of these massacres. Over time, they did have difficulty collecting taxes, and that would weaken the empire, and eventually the empire would become part of the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk about later. All right, the Golden Horde, that would be the other Khanate led by Batu, one of the other grandsons in 1236. They're the ones that invade Russia. And as they entered into Russia, they encouraged the kingdoms and any conquered people to pay tribute, right? We know that Chinese did the same thing, or a tax. They destroyed the city of Kiev, and they ruled northern Russia until about 1380. The effects were both negative and positive, devastation and death, obviously. And it eventually led to a lot of animosity among the Russian people that fueled an eventual takeover or a retaking over of Russia. Russian princes did learn from the Mongols in terms of centralizing their government and having a better military. Because of the Mongol influence and the Mongol power, the Russians basically severed ties with Europe. They were not going to see that direct trade or that European Renaissance spread into Russia, even though Russia is technically Europe. The Renaissance doesn't make its way to Russia because of the Mongol control, the Mongol influence. They did benefit from the trade, and they did, the Russians were making money, but it's the cultural stuff that didn't make its way, like Christianity, for example, or the Protestant Reformation, or the art of the Renaissance, or the humanistic education didn't make its way there, or the literature, for example. All right, the Yuan dynasty. So that I guess it would be considered another Khanate, but it actually became the next Chinese dynasty. So the Mongol rule of China was the dynasty called Yuan, and it was ruled by the Kublai Khan, another grandson. So I guess it's a Khanate, but because it's China, we call it a Chinese dynasty. He attacked the Song dynasty. It took them 11 years, but eventually the Song dynasty was replaced by a Mongol dynasty, or the Yuan dynasty. So we don't call it a Khanate, we call it the Yuan dynasty. But in theory, it could be kind of a Khanate. They did maintain Chinese Confucian traditions. They did promote religious tolerance. There was a lot of loyalty from Buddhists and Taoists who at the time were out of favor because of, again, the tension between Confucianism and Buddhism. They did promote toleration of Muslims and Christians. There was a lot of prosperity due to the opening and maintaining of the Silk Roads. And they actually protected Chinese art and literature. So they promoted Chinese culture. They didn't necessarily, end Confucian ways. They just kind of allowed for it to continue. Eventually, though, the Mongols lose power. By 1242, they withdraw from Eastern Europe. By 1260, they're defeated by Egyptian forces in Palestine. The Ottomans will eventually take over the Ilkhanate. Khanate. They had two failed invasions of Japan, mostly because Japan was an island. They had difficulty in Vietnam because of the tropical environment. No one can win a war in Vietnam, that's for sure. And even in China, there was a lot of resentment began to take over, and eventually the Yuan dynasty was replaced with a new family. As time went on, the Chinese Confucianists were kind of upset because although they did promote the idea of filial piety and respect for your elders, they did get rid of the civil service exams, and they promoted Taoism and Buddhism. And eventually they wouldn't even allow the Chinese to speak Mongolian. The Chinese had to speak their local language. And again, that just led to resentment of Mongol rule. And eventually a Buddhist monk would overthrow the Yuan and found his own dynasty, the Ming dynasty. That's where the Great Wall goes up in 1368. So even though Confucianism was maintained, as time would go on, there would be a decline in Confucianism, if that makes any sense. All right, so what's the bigger picture? Last slide. Definitely revitalized trade between Asia and the old Roman Empire. The kingdoms and states under Mongol control developed centralized governments. But they did help transport that Black Death, by opening those roads and actually by expanding their own empire into Europe. They brought those fleas with them, and they're going to contribute to the Black Death along with those crusaders, those Christian crusaders. Mongol women were more independent than any other group up to this point, and the Europeans would borrow the Mongol military methods, and that will kind of continue into, or they'll use those methods in conquering the Americas. All right, guys, that's it. The essay is important. The essay kind of focuses on some of those other topics that we just read at the end. So good luck.